These are the 7 figures who had the opportunity to change fictional pirate history by becoming an Emperor of the Sea, but for an assortment of reasons did not. Some were crushed on their way to the role, some were disappointed by the criteria and walked out of the Emperor job interview, and a couple of very unlucky ones simply swiped their fate cards at the Emperor supermarket checkout and were declined. But any one of these people could have gone on to become a core fixture of this planet. And we are going to start with Gecko Moria, not usually a character that we bring up first unless we're starting by announcing last place. However, Moria was an incredibly strong candidate to become an Emperor of the Sea in his golden years, which I think is technically golden year singular, because Roger was executed 24 years ago and Moria landed on Wano 23 years ago, where he and his crew fought Kaido and the Beast Pirates and were mostly obliterated from the realm of life. In fact, all Moria took home with him was the corpse of Ryuma and not any of his formerly alive crewmates. However, I do think I have a tendency to sell Gecko Moria a bit short, because even though his campaign for Pirate King only lasted a year, to think that Moria was strong enough to make it all the way to the New World in that singular year is pretty damn incredible, and something that not even the Straw Hats were capable of. And also with Gecko Moria's Devil Fruit, which is not dissimilar from Big Mom's Fruit, Moria had a truly envious amount of power and potential to grow into something that we could even refer to as some sort of shadow god. So it does make you wonder what may have happened if Moria had been a bit more patient. He may have lost his drive in the modern day due to his catastrophic defeat 23 years ago, but back in the day he had as much chance as anyone else did of making it to the top. And this really hits hard to me whenever I go back on Thriller Bark and I see Moria giving his warning to Luffy that he's just not ready for that there New World, because at this point Luffy is on Moria's path. He is set up to make it into the New World within a year and then be completely snuffed out by whichever emperor he's unfortunate enough to come across first. Luffy wasn't even ready to fight Kaido 2 years later when he did get to Wano, so he was certainly in no condition to do any of that pre-time skip, and the same is unfortunately true of Moria. Gecko Moria suffered from the unbelievable infection of being too ambitious without the inbuilt antibiotics of fate on his side, which is the benefit that Luffy has. So if Moria had taken his time, if he'd built up his forces, defeated more opponents around his level, gotten stronger, more experienced, perhaps pushed his Devil Fruit to evolve and awaken, then he could have become the OG 4th Emperor. When Luffy rocked up at Water 7, Garp could have been announcing Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, and Gecko Moria, because Shanks didn't even become an Emperor until 6 years ago. So there was a 17-year gap big enough to fit even Moria's plump posterior, but he got too ahead of himself and had his will crushed by Kaido, thus forever preventing Moria from achieving any goal ever again. And from here, I want to move on to the guy who came within a bee's dick of being recognized as one of the current 4 emperors, and that is Mr. Sir Crocodile. He was so close. All that stood between Crocodile and being immortalized in fictional pirate history was a graphic design mistake. After Buggy the Clown got into some pretty colossal debt to Crocodile, Buggy offered his services to enact Crocodile's plans, which was of course to form the Cross Guild Alliance. And as part of this, Buggy was given the task of marketing Cross Guild, because apparently he has access to a worldwide printing and distribution network. But Buggy's crew was so loyal to him that they placed Buggy in the top center of the Cross Guild poster, and no joke, this is why Buggy is an emperor instead of Crocodile, because the world government and the public saw this poster and immediately assumes that Buggy was in charge. That he, Clown Man, had somehow managed to unite Crocodile and Mihawk under his clown banner, and Buggy was then credited with the creation of Cross Guild itself, and several other events were also misinterpreted in his favor, such as instead of coming to collect his debts from Buggy, the story, as the world knows it, is that Crocodile came to Buggy's aid against the Marines out of sheer undying loyalty. But look, if the graphic design of the poster reflected the accuracy of the situation, then in all seriousness, Crocodile would now be one of the 4 emperors. And the reason why he isn't can be boiled down to this one man. This is Buggy's graphic designer, and he's the one who put Buggy in the quote coolest spot, and as a result, he is one of the most unintentionally impactful characters in all of One Piece history. Although he better hope the Crocodile never finds out, because unlike Mihawk, Crocodile was very not happy to be pushed out of the spotlight and announced as one of Buggy's chief officers instead of making his debut as an Emperor of the Sea. But Crocodile isn't the only one to have been so close to Emperor status, only to have their page of pirate history ripped out of the book before it was even written. As following the raid on Onigashima, which saw the defeat of Big Mom, Charlotte Kakuri was in position to inherit her empire and thus her position as an emperor. Now this probably wouldn't have happened cleanly and without internal dispute, as the hierarchy of the Charlotte family is often based on literal seniority, and so firstborn son Charlotte Perospero seemed to believe that should his mother be defeated, then he would be the one to inherit her position. But I want it noted that these are simply the delusions of a crazed Candyman, and after floating the idea of their family becoming the Perispera Pirates, Charlotte Daifuku quickly interjected and stated that Kakuri would, quote, obviously be the next captain. And given that Perispera was also beaten on Wano alongside his mother, I would assume that Kakuri has now inherited that position. However, his chance for the Emperor title was destroyed by the invasion of the Blackbeard Pirates, really showing us why the Emperor system worked past tense so well in terms of balance. Big Mom made a big move to Wano, which left her territory vulnerable, and so another Emperor stepped in to take advantage of that vulnerability. That threat was what kept the world stagnant for the past however many years. And Blackbeard himself wasn't even part of this infiltration, and this isn't the sole reason why Kakuri is now just the captain of some other pirate crew somewhere, but it was the third defeat suffered by the Big Mom pirates in quick succession. Firstly, Totoland was invaded by Luffy, resulting in the destruction of Whole Cake Chateau. Then Big Mom herself was beaten on Wano, and the remains of her crew were defeated a third time by the Blackbeard pirates. That's 3 strikes and we're done. But if Kakuri had managed to successfully defend, then he would still be in the running to fill one of those 2 vacant slots after Wano. Unfortunately, they were still recovering by the chaos caused by Luffy, and Big Mom selfishly and stupidly decided to take half their fighting force to Wano, and so this was very much the end of the prominence of the Charlotte dynasty. And the other factor is that the Blackbeard pirates got a copy of their road poneglyph, as did Luffy during his infiltration. So now the Big Mom pirates don't even have a resource valuable, worthy of either protecting or targeting. Like the crew itself, the poneglyph now just exists in a state of stillness as the world continues moving around it. And someone who Kakuri can probably identify with better than anyone else is Mako the Phoenix, who was put in a very similar situation after his captain and former Emperor Whitebeard was killed during the Paramount War. After this, Mako, he was in prime position to be anointed as the next Emperor of the Sea in Whitebeard's place. And a big advantage he had over Kakuri is that the former Whitebeard pirates had no intercrew conflict. None of them were vying for power, not even Mako himself. They may not have been biologically related, but they came together like a true family and managed to maintain their position in the New World for a year after the loss of their father. But what Mako needed to truly restore balance was a grand statement to the world. Because as much as people do try to quantify what an emperor is, this much territory, this large of an army, in the end, it's mostly decided by public opinion. Such as if we return to the topic of Crocodile, the distribution of the cross-guild process having Buggy as that central commanding figure is what influenced public opinion to view him as the leader of Cross-Guild, and therefore a natural figure to fill the emperor position. What Mako needed was his probably less comical version of that, because the Whitebeard pirates had suffered a tremendous defeat. Momentum was very much against them. So they needed something to prove to the public that they were still worthy of the influence that the name Whitebeard once commanded. And that event would be the Payback War. I won't go too deeply into it here because I have a whole separate video on the channel covering this event, but this was the last stand of the Whitebeard pirates against the violent incoming waves of Blackbeard. And to put it quite simply, if they had won the Payback War, then Mako would now be an emperor instead of Blackbeard. However, what this battle ended up decisively proving was that the Whitebeard pirates could no longer sustain their role in the balancing act of the New World, so they were destroyed and replaced by a faction that could. Destruction is of course the most common end to an empire, and we've only had one emperor-like figure retire from prominence by choice, and that would be Goldie Roger. However, just like Mako and Kakuri, there was an opportunity for his second-in-command Silvers Rayleigh to inherit Roger's position, as Rayleigh was a man who history remembers as being on par with Roger, hence his epithet the Dark King. This one crew had 2 kings, Pirate King and a Dark King, which is a trend that the Straw Hats are currently following, with Luffy aiming to become the next Pirate King, and Zoro now taking on the conceptually difficult side quest of becoming the King of Hell, however you go about doing that. But obviously, Rayleigh, he had no reason to keep going. He and the Roger Pirates had already done everything that they'd set out to do. But hypothetically, yes, he did have the opportunity, and he could have kept the Roger Pirates together to make a real play to maintain the era of Roger, Whitebeard, and Shiki. Just like Mako, Rayleigh would have had to prove himself, but I don't think that anyone else in One Piece history has been in a better position to do just that, especially with the imminent fall of Shiki right after Roger's execution was announced. Rayleigh had a clear path to prominence. And this is an extremely rare case where an infamous pirate said no thank you to power and influence, instead preferring to settle down and live his best life with his wife, as well as his frequently changing and ever youngening girlfriends, with the occasional selling of himself into slavery to repay his gambling debts, you know, the dream. But this was because after reaching Laugh Tale, all of the Roger Pirates knew that it was time to give things over to the next generation, which also applies to figures like Kozuki Oden, who was only a short step down in strength from Roger and Whitebeard, but ever so charismatic that he could have feasibly become a pillar of the New World, but he had a greater purpose to serve, and that purpose was dancing naked for 5 years in order to something, oh look, Joy Boy's back. You know, there's probably a lot of lost emperors on Roger's crew. Scopper Gaban might be another candidate. It really was like a mini Rocks Pirates. And while most emperors do hail from some sort of impressive pirating pedigree, our next candidate is a complete mysterious lone wolf, and I don't think there is anyone in this world who could deny that, if he so desired, Mr. Dracula Mihawk could have become an Emperor of the Sea. This may be the world's first genuine case of, yeah, I could have gone pro if I wanted to, which is usually said by delusional individuals who are slightly above average in local high school sports. But as a man who is at the very least equal to Shanks in raw power, Mihawk can actually back this kind of talk up. In fact, it's pretty damn ridiculous when you compare their bounties. Mihawk is worth 3.59 billion berries, the highest amount of any individual actor in history, and Shanks is worth just over 4 billion, so approximately 500 million berries more. And to get to that stage, Shanks had to form his crew, his own empire, and claim a large portion of the New World as his. And what even is 500 million berries? Well, 500 million berries is exactly 1 Usopp. So there is currently an Usopp's worth of difference between Shanks and Mihawk. And Shanks had to work infinitely harder to get that Usopp, whereas Mihawk just seems to naturally command that on his own. No crew, no empire, just a man with a real sharp hunk of metal. And while he doesn't want to be an emperor, there's every chance that he could have become one whether he liked it or not. Because as a primary member of Cross Guild, all that would have needed to happen was Mihawk to be placed in the center of the poster, and he would have been declared an emperor under the guise of uniting Crocodile and Buggy. And putting Mihawk in the center of that poster would have been the most natural inclination. Like, if you weren't a furious Buggy simp, that's what you would do. You'd look at those former warlords and you go, Mihawk's probably the guy best fit for leadership. But we know how that story goes, and Mihawk himself is actually quite grateful to the existence of Buggy for taking a lot of the heat off him, because the dude just wants to retire and live out his semi-Rayleigh lifestyle in his gloomy castle with his battle monkeys and his unnecessarily large toilet in the center of a carpeted bathroom with no toilet paper and no sink. That is how desperate Mihawk is for a challenge in this world. To get that thrill, he even defecates on hardcore mode. As opposed to our next lost emperor, who prefers the easiest possible difficulty. And this man goes a bit underappreciated, and I'm sure that he will shock you, but it is self-alleged God Enel. Enel is a very difficult character because he exists in a very different era of One Piece, so much so that he may as well exist in an entirely different manga. Because unlike almost every other character, Enel is a completely isolated existence, and even his expanded cover story continued this by sending him to the moon, the furthest possible place from interacting with anyone else we know. And so his early showcase and subsequent isolation has a tendency to make us forget about just how truly devastating he is. Enel is an interesting exercise because it's kind of like asking what would happen if one of the Marine admirals defected to piracy and started his own crew. Would that admiral then be capable of becoming an Emperor of the Sea? Just how far can you get with pure logiasm goodness? Well, in that case, we're not so sure, but in Enel's case, we do have a very handy metric for this. In the SBS of Volume 43, Oda stated that if Enel was active on the Blue Sea, then his bounty would be 500 million berries. Now, this doesn't sound much like modern standards, but remember, this was published in 2006. And back then, this was the highest bounty revealed to date, even if it was just hypothetical. The officially highest known non-hypothetical bounty was Doflamingo at 340 million berries, so the very idea of reaching 500 million was almost incomprehensible, and a number reserved for the likes of Whitebeard, Roger, and Dragon. However, as we've already said, these days Usopp is worth 500 million, so things have definitely changed. And there is a very good meta argument to be made that Oda never expected bounty inflation to get this out of hand, but as he kept extending the story, he kept needing to raise the stakes in response to that extension. And so bounties have now skyrocketed far beyond their original intention, which means you really can't compare early One Piece bounties directly to modern ones, because there is absolutely no way that, say, the world government would allow Boa Hancock and Sir Crocodile to even be considered for warlord positions if they were only deemed a threat worthy of 80 and 81 million berries respectively, which is why now in the post-warlord system, they're now both worth well over $1 billion. And so to bring this back around to Enel, take Crocodile's increase from 81 million berries to almost 2 billion, and what kind of effect do you think that narrative inflation would have on Enel's 500 million berries? Because I honestly think that we would be looking at a guy in the 2 to 3 billion berry range. Enel is seriously underestimated because he lost to Luffy, his natural counter, and it's very rarely taken into consideration how well Enel would do with his Thunder God fruit against anyone else in the One Piece world. He would decimate all but the very top candidates because he also has haki. In fact, to this day, he still has some of the best observation haki we've ever seen, so it's not like he's fighting completely haki nude. Yes, he does need to put some work into armament, but if he did that then, mate, he would be able to carve out quite a comfortable space for himself as an emperor, with the ultimate goal of being recognized as some sort of god, should he have chosen to go down to the blue sea instead of all the way up to the moon. And I know what you might be saying now. That's great, man, on the internet. You've talked a lot, but where's Shiki? Where's Ochoku? Where's this other character that I'm typing in your comments? And to that, I would say that you need to check out my video on the original emperors, which details the canon revelation of who held these positions before the original four. Because among the original emperors, there was no Kaido, there was no Big Mom, and certainly no Shanks. And if you want to know who took up these spots, then definitely check it out.